Hello, I'm Tiffany from Stitch and Addiction, and I'm excited to welcome you to Virtual JaneCon. Today, we will be discussing Fashion is Political, how the Age of Revolutions influenced fashion and textiles in Jane Austen's lifetime. Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook is here with me to talk about this very intriguing topic. Ayana, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook, which is my handle on all social media. It's also the name of the blog that I originally started like over 10 years ago now, I think. Basically, just discussing fashion history of various eras. I love Jane Austen's time period, like the Regency in England, that I really love to focus on. I love the intersection between politics and fashion and social history and all of it. So I'm really excited to be here today.
I'm so excited that you agreed to do this with me. We've been working hard on reading and all of our notes for the last couple weeks. And our love of Jane Austen, we both love Jane Austen, obviously, also led us to a love of Regency fashion, hence what we're wearing. We are both active in local and national costuming events. And as we've explored historical fashion, we both become more and more intrigued by the factors behind major fashion changes, fashion history, and what caused these changes to occur. So just as today we see with the popularity of minimalist aesthetics following excessive periods of consumption and ornamentation, Regency fashion was a marked departure from the fashion of the previous era. One of the things that you'll see is the undergarments change a lot, the shapes change a lot. So we are going to talk about the things that led to these changes. We might love the fashion of the Regency era for the loveliness of the styling, but it's never just about pretty clothes. Fashion is always a reflection of power, gender, status, and personality. The drastic fashion changes that occurred in the late 1700s were indicative of the wider political and social changes happening in what is known as the Revolutionary Era.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that overview. Since both Tiffany and I have backgrounds in education, we decided to make things a little bit educational here. So here is our timeline of events that happened during Jane Austen's lifetime. This will also be available in the description box. Don't worry about trying to memorize anything. There's no pop quiz. But we're just going to walk through some of these key events here. And then, of course, you will have it for reference down below. Jane Austen was born in 1775. Those of us who are American know that that's a very significant year because right after that, we start going into full-on American Revolution. So before that, America was just a colony of England. The English weren't too concerned about that, right? Like, this is important for us, not so much important for her. It's funny to me because it's such a big deal, because it really does kick off a lot of other revolutions and social political movements that happen later. It's a big deal that a colony decided, you know what? We just don't want to be a colony anymore. Let's see, 1789. So roughly, I'm not great at math.
About 13 years.
Thank you. 13 years, so not too long. And especially Jane Austen, she would have been about 14 or so at the time. So right when you're sort of coming into your own, if we imagine 13, 14-year-olds now, you're sort of just beginning to understand the world and what these bigger movements mean for you and your life. The French Revolution starts. So we had one revolution where, she was just a baby, and then another one when she's a 13-year-old, 13, 14. And this one was a lot more intensive, a lot more social rather than just political. I would say the American Revolution, America's independent and that was a big deal, but American life didn't really change all that much. French life, though, changes a lot with that Declaration of the Rights of Man, stating that all French citizens should be equal. The American Constitution also says all people should be equal, but we kind of quickly ignore that. The French did not. It caused a lot of, shockwaves to be felt throughout the world. And this was really scary for the English, much more so than the American one, because the French Revolution was really more of an uprising of the working and peasant classes. So it didn't start out as a political issue where one set of people in one government, American colonies, had a problem with the other set of government, British ruling classes. The French Revolution was a revolution of working people against the upper classes. It starts out as just riots over things like the price of bread and escalates very quickly to killing off a lot of aristocrats, killing the monarchs. So this was a very scary time to be rich. Keep that in mind for later. Right after this French Revolution, where you have not politicians and upper class people arguing with upper class people, you have the Haitian Revolution right after that, which sort of takes that idea of the working classes rising up against the upper classes one step further. And you have the enslaved classes rising up against their ruling classes, which, again, we have not seen on such a large scale, at least in any recorded history. And this, of course, if you're an English aristocrat, is even scarier. We're now like 3 levels deep in revolutions. And this one is like, okay, not only are white working class people going to be a threat to me, now Black enslaved classes are going to be a threat to me. What's next? Are women going to rise up and want rights too? It's it's just a lot happening. And I feel like it's no coincidence that Jane Austen writes Pride and Prejudice just a few years after the Haitian Revolution starts. And the French Revolution is still going on, by the way. Depending on how you learned history, it might seem as if these are back to back to back. No, it's still happening. People are still being guillotined, right? Imprisoned, things like that. And you can see in that last line of the timeline, the Napoleonic Wars start, because French has bigger problems, right? They're trying to stamp down their working classes at home, their working classes abroad, the troops are spread out. And Napoleon Bonaparte seems to think, okay, this is a great time to try to take over Europe. Jane Austen is, putting out some really intentional work here, but there's a lot happening. The Haitian Revolution has just ended. A few years prior to that, the international slave trade is abolished by England and the U.S. That just means they cannot continue with the transatlantic slave trade, but you can still have domestic slavery. France, however, I think was tired and they stopped all slavery at home, abroad, doesn't matter. Right before, again, with the math, Tiffany, what is 1807 and 1811? How many years are we talking? There we go. That's a very small period, especially when we're talking about how long it takes for mail and things like that to travel. So again, it's not something that would have been lost by Jane Austen, who would have been a young woman by this time. In 1811, we have the Prince of Wales becoming regent. That's where the term regency comes from. And then Pride and Prejudice, which she wrote many, many years before, finally gets published. A lot of people think this was the first of her works to be published because it's arguably the most famous.
When it was published, it was actually published as by an author of Sense and Sensibility, because Sense and Sensibility did enjoy good success. And so her publisher was actually like, you know what, I'm just going to publish this at my own risk. I'm not even going to publish this on commission because you did so well with your first one.
I think that's so funny that the publisher is kind of thinking, oh, I don't know, this is a real risk here, Miss Austen. And, with hindsight, we know that that was the best decision they ever made. One key novel I think that doesn't get a lot of attention is Mansfield Park, 1814, right? So smack dab in the middle of the Regency. But it is the only one of Jane Austen's novels that tackles the topic of slavery head on. And you sort of wonder, I think the Haitian Revolution ended 1804, so the last of our big revolutions. That's, again, just 10 years. Imagine where we were 10 years ago at the time of this recording. It would have been 2015. It would have felt quite recent in a lot of people's minds, and I think it was very much on time for her to publish a novel that sort of brings slavery into the forefront and is deriding it. We have England abolishing their international slave trade, and you kind of feel like it's sort of a hint, sort of to the USA, like, okay, France did it, England did it, what's going on, America? So with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we have Emma being published. And same thing, it's tagged as by the author of Pride and Prejudice. So again, letting readers know, if you like this last hit, check this one out. And then unfortunately, for the world of literature and of course, her family, Jane Austen had a very early death in 1817 at just 41. And then her last two big novels were published after her death, and these in her name. She finally gets her props after death. So
yes, her brother acted as her literary agent and made sure that those got out to the world. But it's also interesting looking at this timeline because she literally dies only 2 years after the Napoleonic Wars ended, and the American Revolution officially starts 1 year after her birth. So her entire lifetime was during this era of revolutions and wars and fights for power. And so it influenced, I believe, probably every aspect of her life. But of course, we're going to mostly talk about how it influenced the fashion in her lifetime. European fashion for the previous 200 years before Jane Austen's birth, basically from the Renaissance in the 1500s to the Revolutionary era in the 1700s, was rigidly structured. Women wore specific undergarments to emphasize their bodies and make a certain fashionable silhouette. This included the heavily boned stays that shaped their torso into a cone shape, as well as the farthingales and peignets on the bottom half, which emphasized the derriere and the hips. So for about 200 years, you're seeing some form of that fashionable silhouette and those types of undergarments. This fashion was used to indicate their wealth and their social rank. There were sumptuary regulations that codified which classes could wear which kind of fabrics, which styles, which trims, so on and so forth. This is why Marie Antoinette wearing a chemise a la Reine was such an uproar, because it was not considered part of what was allowed for her class to wear. We're going to talk a lot more about that later, though. The earliest sumptuary laws were passed by the Romans, and they legislated excessive luxury in clothing, meals, furniture, and gifts. Europeans passed their first sumptuary laws in Genoa in 1157. And as European countries became more and more developed and more people had access to more wealth and different styles of fashion, those in power kept passing more and more sumptuary laws because they wanted to keep the power in their hands and to keep those specific fashions and styles for themselves. By the time of the Age of Revolutions, there were 20 or more laws in France that regulated what people could wear, what classes could wear what clothes, all of those different things. Now, of course, by this time, literacy is on the rise. But for many years previously, the majority of the people were illiterate. So clothing was used to visually portray the power and prestige and rank that people held. You had sumptuous fabrics, vibrant colors, and surface adornments, as well as specific forms and shapes to show who held the power politically, religiously, or otherwise, and who didn't have the power. However, as revolutions spread around the world, challenging these sumptuary laws was one more way that the working class and the working people challenged the power and status of the monarchy and others in power, and sought democracy, not only through gaining equal rights, but also through the visualization of what they were wearing.
yeah, I think it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around now, where everyone can more or less wear the same thing. Anyone can just wear a t-shirt and jeans. And in the past, that was not the case. You were absolutely wearing very different things depending on what class you were, so that people knew how to treat you, basically, for better or for worse. And so, yeah,
Right.
with these sumptuary laws, it's funny because you're only going to make something a law if it's been a problem, right? You can sort of hear the nervousness of these upper class people being like, but wait a minute, what if someone thinks that this lower class person is wearing the same thing as me, that they're my equal? And it's like
Right.
the anxiety just coming out of the page.
Or they feel threatened, right? They're like, I can't feel threatened, we cannot let this happen. We can't lose this power that we're wielding over these people. Yeah.
So on that note, this relates a lot to political figures such as Marie Antoinette and her dual named, either Chemise à la Reine or the Robe à la Creole. It basically kicks off a new movement, let's say in the mainstream. In 1783, when Marie Antoinette shocks the public when she appears in a formal painting wearing this white cotton unstructured gown that's very different from what we talked about before with all of those undergarments and that, fabric with lots of sheen, lots of color. This gown becomes the title of the portrait, actually. But, of course, this gown had been around for a long time before. It's just, when the queen wears it, okay, now that's something we have to talk about. And so the reason why this dress has two different names is because these loose cotton white gowns typically were underwear, so kind of similar to, what we're both wearing right now. Right. But these were previously worn under your clothes. This was considered underwear, maybe pajamas. You would never wear something like this outside of your house. The exception would be Caribbean Creoles. That title can mean native to an area, or it can have different racial connotations, which we'll get into a little bit later. But basically, think of it as Caribbean for now. Caribbean women of all races who were wearing this because it's hot in the Caribbean. Of course, women did wear, the structured, garments whenever they would have a ball or something like that. But for every day, you can't wear those hot silks and the panniers and all of that. So they were wearing these loose, sort of underwear garments, I guess, sort of like walking around wearing your nightgown today. But if you think about it, if you're somewhere, along the beach and the hot sun, that makes a lot of sense. A nightgown actually would be a better choice than, jeans and, maybe a hoodie, right?
Well, and also the cotton is going to be a lot cooler to wear than the silks and the wools that Europeans tended to wear, especially the silks for the upper classes.
Exactly. Yeah. Europe is much colder than the Caribbean, right? So they're preparing for that type of weather, but that doesn't necessarily work in a different climate. So, of course, you have women who are working for a living. Even their special occasion clothes are not going to be those silks, those wools that the upper classes were wearing in the Caribbean for their special occasions, right? So these women weren't just wearing their, white loose cotton sometimes. They were wearing it all the time because they had to get things done. So, of course, the upper classes see that and go, oh, that looks so much more practical. We're going to wear that. There's a quote that says, the very light-skinned free women of color dared to invent an entirely new kind of women's clothing. Technically, the invention abided by the 1754 edict because it was made of cotton. It evaded sumptuary laws by being neither the privileged three-part gown nor the humble skirt and jacket combination. It was instead a one-piece dress called a gaule, sometimes spelled gaule, Gaulle. This dress dramatically replaced the fitted tops and bell-shaped skirts of conventional women's clothing with a straight silhouette from shoulder to ankle while retaining the long fitted sleeves of gown bodices. So there we have it, right? This is something that the upper classes in the Caribbean are looking and seeing their working or enslaved women wearing and going, that seems way more comfortable than my very fitted outfit. I think I'm going to take that. So you have this dress referred to by either term, meaning robe à la Creole, which is Creole dress, literally, or chemise à la reine, the queen's chemise, meaning undergarment. So either way, it is named after the people wearing them. This dress was definitely worn by women, even in France, at home. And things like that, but it was not made for public viewing. So for any woman to be painted, immortalized in this dress, especially a queen, seemed to many people irresponsible. This is what our taxes are going towards, so our queen can frolic around in her underwear. A lot of people thought it was unseemly, just very inappropriate. We want to see our queen looking powerful and grand and, not just kind of lounging in her sweatpants, essentially.
That's a good comparison, a really good comparison. Well,
Yeah.
and also like wearing cotton was not supposed to be allowed for the upper class. Louis XIV had actually not approved of this. It undermined his sumptuary supremacy of the court, right? And so that was another reason why everybody was like, oh my gosh, why is she wearing cotton? This is not even allowed in the courts. And now she's sitting for a portrait in cotton.
Yeah, let's talk about the politics behind that. Cotton at this time, it's again one of those things, especially for us Americans, where it's such a staple fabric, crop. This was not the case in the 1700s. Cotton was not a big industry at all. It was something a few farmers grew, and that was kind of it. But around Jane Austen's time, we start to see more and more of it. Cotton is a native crop to India. Indians had been growing it for quite some time and using it for their own fabrics, which the British very much admired and were trading like crazy already. But it was not something homegrown just yet, or at least colony grown just yet. So France has this same issue of like, okay, this isn't our fabric. We have to find ways to tax it. We have to find ways to limit it. This is going to hurt our own French silk weavers and guilds. We have to make sure that this new cotton fabric doesn't overshadow our own French existing wool industries, and the things we already have. But of course, when the queen wears it, even if you think it's inappropriate, everyone else wants to wear it. So you have a lot of smuggling and like sort of black market stuff happening to get this cotton to make these loose flowy dresses that everyone seemed to be wearing, but somehow no one had bought. Right? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Where'd you get that?
So it definitely set the stage for fashion to completely change as the revolutions are occurring, right? It's, getting smuggled and sold into France and into Britain. I believe that was also true with the Paisley shawls. I think if I remember correctly, reading about Jane Austen's fashion, that was another thing that was like very in demand in Britain. So let's talk about two women who kind of led the fashion revolution as part of the French Revolution. And these two women experienced firsthand the horrors of the French Revolution, and they used what they experienced to lead the way in changing the fashions. And you see like an incredibly rapid change from the 1780s to the 1790s. If you're perusing through fashion plates, the change is so dramatic. And it was because everything was kicked off by the French Revolution. So Josephine Bonaparte was one of these women that led the changing way. She was born Marie Joseph Rose Tascher de la Pagère in June of 1763 on the island colony of Martinique. Of course, this is a French colony, and she is the daughter of a wealthy plantation master. Now, her family used her as a pawn to climb the ladder of social status. At only the age of 15, she was shipped off to Paris to marry the heir of her aunt's noble lover. And it was not a happy marriage. It got her to France, but it was not a happy marriage. He ultimately was the victim of the guillotine during the terror, and she was imprisoned as a result of her association with him and what he was associated with. She finally rose to her place of influence when she met and married Napoleon Bonaparte. Sound familiar? The Napoleonic Wars in the 1790s. And when she married Napoleon, she changed her name from Rose to Josephine. So while she was in prison, she became friends with Theresa. Theresa Tallien's family had gained their power and influence not through nobility, but through her father's business sense. He was the banker for the King of Spain, and she was born in 1773 and noticed from a very young age for her stunning beauty. At the age of 12, her father decided that it's too dangerous to let her be single anymore. We got to find her a match as soon as possible. So they went on a 2-year journey to get her wardrobe completely updated to try to marry her into nobility. And at the age of 14, she was married to Jean-Jacques de Fontenay, a man whose family had just barely entered the aristocracy. Once again, an unhappy marriage. It actually ended in divorce. So right about the time the revolution began, divorce became legal in France. Jean-Jacques and Theresa very eagerly took advantage of this opportunity. And so as her marriage with Jean-Jacques ended, she began a relationship with Jean Lambert Tallien. And most commonly, she's known as Theresa Tallien, although she had, I believe, 3 different marriages. Most commonly, she's known as Theresa Tallien. I know, right? The scandal.
Whoa.
Plus many, many side affairs, if we believe everything that's written. She had, I believe, 11 children and 3 marriages. And I think it was 5 men were the confirmed fathers of the 11 children. So she was known for her great beauty. Everybody would just come to even just look at her because her reputation was so great. Her curves, her coloring, her hair, everything was considered like the perfect example of classicism. And so they would come and just gaze on her, and men would just fall in love with her. But she was also known for her kindness. And because of her association with Tallien, she was imprisoned, and she actually wrote a letter to him during her stay in the prison that prompted him to overthrow Robespierre's radical regime. By the time all of this has happened, she has become one of the most influential women in France in the 1790s. So these 2 women met in prison and turned into fast friends, right? In prison, they were stripped of everything. They were stripped of not only, their freedom, but also all of their outer clothes. So their silks and all of the stuff that showed their status. And they were left in their undergarment, a simple chemise or shift. And when Theresa left prison, she decided that instead of going back to how she used to dress, the way that the people of nobility dressed, she was going to dress like she dressed in prison. She was going to turn that into fashion. And Josephine and Theresa realized they had the same determination to remake themselves together. As a result of the French Revolution and all these other influences going on in the world right now, neoclassicism and the Enlightenment and all of these things coming together, pure white clothing is now the thing, right? Simplicity and pure white clothing is the thing. Now, most sources will tell you that they got their inspiration from Greek and Roman classicism. However, as we've already talked about with the robe a la Creole and also Indian cotton, but not just Indian cotton, there was a piece of clothing worn by Indian men called a jama, and Europeans were taken by the way that this clothing looked, partly because they loved the fine cotton muslin, but also because the silhouette echoed the classical silhouettes and also the robe a la Creole. And so Josephine and Theresa took all of these pieces together, this whole minimalist Enlightenment train of thinking, and they created what we know as Regency dress, right? So you have the high fitted bodice, you have the long loose skirt, and these things were all drawn from these colonies fashions rather than classics as much as we actually have been taught.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of different factors coming into play at once. It's not any one thing. It's not just the Roman Greek revival. It's not just Marie Antoinette. It's not just the revolution. It's so many things all coming together. And coincidentally, yeah, all in Jane Austen's lifetime.
And one of the things that was interesting is that the undergarments completely changed as well, right? You go from these highly structured boned stays to stays that are very minimally boned. They function basically like a push-up bra would today, and that's basically all they did. They weren't there to pull in the waist. They weren't there to really shape your upper torso. They were just there to support the breasts, and that was it. And the undergarments themselves became very minimal. You still, of course, wore like a shift or chemise, sometimes a petticoat, although the French were a little more daring. Sometimes they did not wear petticoats under theirs. Scandal. And Theresa was actually known for how little clothing she would wear. And one of the ways she would achieve this is she would wear nude colored undergarments underneath. So it looked like she literally had nothing on but her outer dress, which was made of these thin Indian cottons.
I mean, we stand a queen who will push the envelope. No, and again, I think that's such a great point about the underwear, because again, kind of drawing back to that influence of these very wealthy, like upper class women in Europe being influenced by all these other factors, but one of which was the working class or enslaved women who, again, wouldn't have all of the trappings that a rich woman would anyway. So you kind of have to wonder too if that was an influence that, maybe some slave owner's wife in Martinique is watching these women go by as they do their daily work, with minimal bus support and thinking, gosh, that looks comfortable in this heat. I wonder if maybe I could just take mine off a little bit. Like, you sort of wonder, like, how many other factors are coming into play.
You really do. And of course, it also influenced menswear, right? Because this is, once again, the result of the Enlightenment and simplicity kind of coming into play, and moved from these pastel, ornate outfits of the Rococo period into what we would call now the men's suits, right? The three-piece suits, much duller, more everyday, practical kind of colors. And with this, women also adopted a piece of this clothing, actually two pieces specifically. One of these was the redingote, which was typically worn for horseback riding or for traveling. And if you were an influential woman during the French Revolution, you would have your portrait painted in a redingote to show what cause you were supporting. But also, women adopted the Spencer jacket during this era, which was a cropped off form of the men's jacket.
Yeah, clothing gets a lot sportier, a lot more, you sort of start to see movement. Even if you look at paintings and things like that, the people look like they can move a bit more comfortably. Whereas before, everyone looks great. I love a great silk gown, like you would not believe. But they don't really look like they can get up and move very easily. They look, sort of like little dolls when you look at those paintings. The Haitian Revolution does not get as much attention as I think it really does deserve for fashion and then just society in general. The way that the American Revolution first brought up this idea that colonies could become independent from their home country, the Haitian Revolution brought about this idea that people who have been oppressed can break free themselves, not wait to be freed, right? So like in America, the Civil War, the enslaved had to wait to be freed. Of course, there were slave rebellions, there were uprisings. Of course, these people weren't passive, just kind of, accepting mistreatment. But I mean on a large scale, right? Something that would be in the mainstream, not just a few little, uprisings and rebellions here and there that can be put down with the militia. So the Haitian Revolution was the French Revolution, but on steroids. I don't want to say chaos, because I feel like when you start to say, well, it was one of the most violent and chaotic of revolutions, yes, but is not, slavery violent and chaotic? It's the most violent thing you could do, to kidnap someone, bring them to somewhere else, make them work very hard to the point of almost death forever, and then also say, well, your children have to as well. That's extremely chaotic. Like, there's no way to say that, well, there was peace and then the Haitian Revolution came along and everything got so violent. I think we have to be very careful about that. But this was the first time that level of violence did reach the mainstream white elite. And so, like you said, we do start to see figures who aren't necessarily the top of society, right? The monarch, and then the medieval period, the church, right? You start to see it trickle down a little bit, and then people who aren't necessarily as high ranking in society, suddenly, hey, they're the people to model after. So this is super important for the Haitian Revolution, because that minimalism that we're talking about, these just plain white chemises, and for men, riding clothes, right? These things really changed the world because previously there was no concept that you could be a subjugated class and take control yourself. That was not it. If something did change for you, it was because you petitioned to the government, you made a plea to the king, something like that. Someone was going to give you your liberty, your freedom. The American Revolution proved this because, we got freedom from England, but we didn't really change anything on a societal level. Women did not get that easy divorce that France got. Slavery was still a thing, didn't change at all. Native Americans were still being pushed off of their ancestral lands, no protections there. Life pretty much went on as normal, except you paid taxes to a different guy. But the French Revolution and Haitian revolutions both really turned that on its head. It sort of was a big, well, what if? What if we did not listen to our betters? What if we decided instead of waiting for power to come to us, we just took it? So by November 1791, we start with just I don't want to say simple, but a slave rebellion. These happened a lot. The white elite were ready for them. They were afraid of them. That's important. But this one was different because it couldn't get put down. So by the time you get to November 1791, you have about 80,000 enslaved, or maybe formerly, depending on how far they were going, people who were going around to any plantation, any, residence they could find, and they were absolutely burning it down and killing any white people that they could find. Like, that is fact. Both sides agree on that. Okay. So this was very much echoing the French Revolution, where peasant classes of women even, and that was considered very unfeminine to involve yourself in politics, right? Were going around killing any wealthy person they could see. So we start to see this idea of wealth being connected to an oppressive class, or if not oppression, a class that is now not in power, but endangered. Now that wealth makes you not someone to be emulated, but someone to be targeted, this presents a really big issue for the wealthy white elite around the world, right? So after a while, we have the American Constitution being put forth in the 1770s. We have the French, and then the Haitians put forth their own that is modeled after the French Declaration of Rights of Man. All of these saying all people are created equal. All people are created equal, right? But the American one didn't really do anything with that. It's sort of a throwaway line. The French didn't really do anything with that. It's sort of a throwaway line. And the Haitians were like, okay, we're tired of this. We are going to take this seriously. So how do we do that, right? It definitely is one of those things that scared the pants off of everyone in power. And I mean quite literally the pants, because once all of this killing starts taking place, let's say on one end of the island and you're over here on this end, you're thinking, what? I got to get out of here. Yep. And if you're boarding a ship who, for one thing, I can imagine the anxiety too, if you're like a slave owner on one end of the island. First of all, who's packing your bags? Probably your enslaved workers. That's got to be real awkward, right? Oh man, there's all these slaves freeing themselves. Come on, Jacques, we got to pack. Is he going to be too motivated to help you get out? I don't know. So you have, for this first time, white elites leaving in droves, leaving from Haiti and going where? They're going to France. Yep. They're going to America. Some of them are even going to England, depends, right? But for the first time, you have people who are not flaunting their wealth and saying, oh, look at me, look at my plantation. Oh, I have so much money. Look, you can see it on my dress. You have people who are very much trying to stay under the radar and going, yeah, can we just get that ticket rolling, please? I'd like to get out. And so that was not lost on fashion. For the first time, you had people in Europe sort of sitting down and thinking, well, okay, I know we've been going back and forth with this issue about slavery and is it wrong, is it right? But it seems like now it's also dangerous. Like I could be killed, my family could be killed because of our ownership of other people. That undoubtedly has to change the way that you look at fashion. For the first time, you want to not associate yourself with this class of people who, maybe are doing something morally wrong, but also are getting thrown right and left in prison, no matter how beautiful they may be, like, our good friend Theresa, are getting executed, no matter how much power they may have. The monarchs of France, right, Louis and Marie Antoinette, anointed by God, still beheaded, right? So all of a sudden, you want to really distance yourself from the wealthy. And so, yeah, it's just one of the reasons, right? We have the Greek and Roman revival, we have changes in textiles, and now we also have, oh no, wealth is not good right now. There's a few years here where it's not really great to appear wealthy. Of course, you still want to be, right? Who doesn't love money? But for the first time, being too wealthy could get you into trouble. So you have 13 years of the Haitian Revolution of these Creole plantation owners, and by that meaning Creole being native to the Caribbean islands where they were born, even though they are a French ancestry, or in the case of England, right, Jamaica and Barbados and things like that, European ancestry, but Creole as in native to that area. Really being a problem. This is now a problem. Before it was sort of, Marie Antoinette with the robe à la Creole. She's, oh, look at her frolicking in the fields and her, little loose dress. Oh, just like a Creole plantation owner. Now, that's definitely not something you want to be. You want to look as simple as possible. You want more chemise, less la reine, right? And you're like, oh, I didn't have anything to do with that. Look at me. I'm just a simple, I'm a merchant's wife. I don't have anything to do with that. And the thing about the Haitian Revolution was that it was modeled after the French. So for the first time, you have Europe having to sort of look at itself in the mirror and say, if we are saying these rights are for every man, every person, the French, their tagline for their revolution was Liberté, Égalité et Fraternité, which is liberty, equality, and brotherhood. How can you have those things and still enslave people? So obviously you have to have a moment of reckoning. Not to mention France is very busy just trying to put out all these fires. We have Napoleon, we have England, we have Haiti. So they finally decide, I don't know if they had a change of heart or just a change in finances, and they decide, look, okay, we just have to end this now. And it's very interesting that France recognizes Haiti as a country in 1825. America does not do so until the Civil War. So we still see that fear associated with, slave owning, with wealth in Europe and England as well, right? America, that still has slavery very much more or less under control, doesn't feel that need. So it's interesting that the Regency is very much associated with this fashion, this simplistic, this minimalist fashion. America still is wearing those things, but they're not as concerned with it because it's not a power struggle there the way that it is in Europe.
And it's interesting too, when you look at how the American Revolution influenced fashion, it had more influence in men's fashion, but not a lot of influence in women's fashion, which is part of why men's fashion was influenced across the Atlantic in Europe, was partly because of people like Franklin and some of the things that he wore and different things that influenced how France and European men began to dress. But the women's fashion was completely the reverse. It was being influenced not because of the American Revolution, but because of the influences from Europe and the Caribbean. Of course, the Haitian Revolution has not even ended, and we have Napoleon and his grab for power. Probably one of the few times in history, if I recall my history correctly, that France had any kind of dominance on the mainland there, and people were actually a little bit scared of France. Yeah. And this these Napoleonic Wars took almost half of Austen's lifetime. So, as we talked about, basically her entire life, there was either a Revolutionary War going on or the Napoleonic Wars. And in the American Revolution and in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was immediately involved in those, of course. And France was not that far away. So, I'm sure, there was a lot of influence from that as well. So, just living under that her entire lifetime is you have to think about how that would have influenced. Of course, she talks a lot about the men being in the military and being in the Navy and all of those different things. So it influenced, I believe, her relationships as well as her fashion. And so because Britain was at war so much of the time, military clothing was one of the strongest influences on civilian style during her lifetime. This was due to the constant presence of militia and regiments in local towns. Of course, you had someone you knew and loved. Austen herself had a brother in the military that was in the military and, would come home and see you. And so, of course, you want to show your support for them. This was a thing women did a lot during that era. We still do it, I believe, unconsciously.
You know what? This kind of reminds me of, I don't know if I'm showing my age here, but in the early 2000s when everyone wore camouflage because of the war in Iraq, Iraq and Afghanistan, you had all these guys wearing camo who've never seen combat. And then, all the girls started doing it because the guys were doing it and wanted to, show that support back home.
Yeah, so I believe it's still, like, you can see it very clearly in history, but I believe it still does. We still do it today without even really thinking about it sometimes. And so, of course, the men's fashions, as we talked about, were influenced. They were also influenced by the more practicality of the military dress. So this also resulted in their more sober, toned down clothing that we talked about earlier. And the creation of the British red coat was kind of a branding that George III did for Britain. He often had himself painted in a red military coat. And so the red contrasted very nicely with the white of the very popular women's dresses of the era. And so not only did it look good when you had the men dressed in their red coats and the women in their white dresses, but women also adopted that into their fashion. So as we talked about, they adopted the redingote and the spencer as their outerwear, and red and navy were often very common colors for those pieces. They would complete these with braids, cords, tassels, frogging, anything that would mimic the uniform decorations seen on the men's uniforms. And so these are all common. You have gold braids, epaulets, high stiff collars, brass buttons. And by 1815, the focus has shifted to the trims and no longer the fabric. So for a long time, this cotton fabric was a big deal, but now it's kind of shifted more to the trims, and some new technology has allowed them to be able to do things a little bit easier with their trims. And so women would not only do it with the military inspired colors of navy and red and gold, but often they would use pastel colors, like you can see some with yellows and lavenders and greens, to still show this military influence in their fashion.
Yeah, it's almost like everyone was trying to look really tough and saying, France, you won't beat us. We're tough, hardy English English men and women.
We're going to bring our wool outer garments back out. Away with the cotton. We'll wear those for the undergarments and the dresses, but not, we're going to bring the wool back out.
And yeah, that's a really good point too about that, because the technology starts to change in ways that make all this possible, right? So even if the desire is there, it could never have taken charge, I guess, of the fashion world in the way that it did if the technology couldn't support it. I think that's a big part of why, England had been doing trade with India for years, by the time we get to the 1770s, but you still don't have cotton coming in and taking charge because you just don't have the technology to support it. But now in the late 1700s, you start getting things like the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, the spinning mule, all of these, sort of fun names that we have for technology that will allow materials to be processed more quickly, processed more efficiently, better ways to handle the fibers, all of these different things, making it possible to get more and more cotton either washed, shipped, transported, sorted, all of those things. I am not too deep into the textile side, but basically allowing them to all be processed much more quickly, thereby bringing down the price, right? In addition to having the labor to do so being very cheap, or in the case of slavery, free, your profit margin can now go up, 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 and make that fabric a lot cheaper for people on the purchasing end, right? The other fabrics that were traditional in England, wool, linen, are still there, but they can't quite keep up with the way that cotton is starting to boom. Especially because, like we talked about, they're just cheaper. Either you're getting them cheaply from Indian labor, Egyptian labor through the British Empire. They don't colonize those countries just yet, but they do have very close relationships with them that they are abusing. And so they're getting things for very, very cheap. And then, of course, you have the American colonies, where cotton is just starting to be a plant that people care about. When we're thinking of Haiti and stuff like that and these plantations that they're burning down, they're not growing cotton, they're growing sugar. So maybe that's another video, but that is really the cash crop that everyone's worried about. It's not cotton yet, but all of a sudden, with the new technology, wait a minute, we can make cotton this very cheap fabric that even working people in Europe in America, can wear and make all kinds of clothing out of it, where we don't have to worry about its durability, or it's very flexible in terms of how it can be washed, all types of weathers and things like that. So we start to see the cotton market overtaking these traditional fabrics like wool and linen. They're still around. They still get clothing made out of them, but just nothing like cotton. It just kind of completely takes over, especially as we get further and further into not so much 1700s, but the 1800s. It just really starts to boom and just eclipses everything else.
A lot of times the spinning could not keep up with the weaving. It took longer to spin the threads than it did to weave the fabric. And so the inventions, the jenny and the spinning mule and everything, were really good for cotton, but they did not work very well on wool and linen. So it took a lot longer to invent something that could spin those fibers faster. And I mean, cotton imports grew so rapidly that in 1791, Britain transported 38,000 Africans to the cotton plantations of America. And that was more than half of the total European slave trade for that year. So it was really coming into its own during that same era, the 1790s and the early 1800s. So the cotton industry in the United States, through very nefarious means, of course.
Yeah, cotton just completely takes over. And I mean, there are still other crops being grown, but as far as textiles are concerned, it just becomes so much cheaper. By the way, this is all being shipped to English factories. So it's really funny that you have, I think, what did we say in our timeline? 1807, I believe, where the international slave trade is abolished in England and the USA. And Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, and this sort of finger wagging at America, and how could you do this? I can't remember the quote about sort of England guaranteeing the rights of any enslaved person breathe free air and English soil, something like that. But it's these English mills, right? The cotton mills, the textile mills that are weaving cotton from plantations. We talk about the Industrial Revolution and, oh man, textile advances, all these English looms and strides made. What are they processing in those textile mills? You know what I mean? It's all so interconnected. Where are they getting all this fabric from? It didn't just appear. So yeah, I mean, it's just with the free and cheap labor of all these exploited classes who in just a few decades before had risen up and said, no more of this. Fast forward to the early 1800s, all that's over, and we're back to, subjugating women and children in northern English textile mills.
Yeah, you and I love to talk about fast fashion, the sustainable fashion, right? Yes. And think about where our clothes today come from, right? So, maybe you buy a garment that's made in America, but then, where did the fabric for that garment come from, right? Or you buy a garment in America, but, where was it manufactured and who was subjugated or underpaid in order to, make that happen? If you look at clothing in the 18th century and previous to then, and even in the 19th century, it wasn't completely changed by that point. Clothing and textiles were one of the most valuable things you could have. I'm reading a really interesting book called The Clothes on Her Back that really makes that point, because it took so much time and effort and all of those things to create. So with the falling prices for clothing and textiles and fabrics, what exploitation was happening to make that happen, right? So and you have to wonder, like, when Austen is choosing her fabrics and making her garments, what is she thinking? Like, is she choosing specific fabrics or specific designs to show her alignment with any of these politics that are going on, right? Does she think about the cotton and the slave trade? We know she thought about the slave trade because she mentions it in Mansfield Park. Does she think about, military designs in her dresses because of her brothers being involved in the wars? And we know she was very perceptive, right? Her writing reveals so many of her satirical observations about the social structures of the day. And so you just wonder, how much did her observations on the politics of the day come to bear on her choice of fabrics and clothing styles, right? We know from her descriptions of her dresses and her letters and the, surviving clothes that we have of hers, that she did adhere to the general fashion of the day. She wasn't going completely against the flow, but you just wonder, what did she think about all of this?
Yeah, I think that's something important to think about when we choose our own clothes. That question of how is this made so cheaply? And, sometimes it is one of those things where it may not be, I'm sure it wasn't practical for Jane Austen herself to grow the flax, harvest it in, turn it into linen. Like, it's not necessarily saying that you cannot participate in fashion just because it may be a really egregious system. But it is important to make sure that you're aware of what your choices are going towards, what your money is going towards. I think Jane Austen was very savvy about that. I think that if you look at her clothing choices, the way that she makes and remakes garments, the sort of things that she chooses, the types of clothing she was wearing, she was definitely trying to show, support for England during the Napoleonic Wars. All of these things I think she was thinking about, and we should think about more. It's so easy to be very removed from where our clothes come from in today's age because we don't see textile mills on our, drive to work or school. But
Right.
if you drive in the middle of nowhere in Texas, you can still see the cotton fields.
It's just like we talk about with, getting into historical costuming and historical fashion, right? It's not just about a pretty dress, right? You have to think about what you're wearing, what you're making it of, what's the history behind it. And you have to be conscious of all of those things because they are tied to social and political movements of the past. And just because it's pretty doesn't always mean that it's something you should go out and wear.
Yeah, let's just acknowledge the history behind the clothes, the journey behind the clothes.
And so that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Ayana, for joining and bringing all of your historical perspective. Ayana has great perspectives on history. So definitely go follow her. Love reading all of her stuff. You want to say anything about any of that, Ayana?
Yeah, thank you so much for watching, everyone. And Tiffany, thank you so much for having me. I am such a fashion history nerd. Once you start digging into where our clothes come from and how certain styles came to be, how certain fabrics came to be, it's addictive. So please feel free to follow me on all of the things. And I am right now trying to get more into the 20th century. Jane Austen always calls me back, but if any of the things we talked about today are interesting, then I think you'd really like some World War II types of fashion deep dives, which I'm hoping to do soon. So Thanks so much.
Definitely follow Ayana, and definitely check out all of the other virtual JaneCon videos. They're linked below for the playlist, so you can check it out that way. Just put it on play and enjoy it in the background this weekend as you work on your tasks around the house or creative endeavors or whatever you're doing with your weekend. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that if you enjoyed today's video, you will like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.